Hello, today's Wednesday the 17th of March. We're getting closer to Easter, and each Wednesday leading up we're looking at different predictions Jesus makes about his coming death and resurrection. We looked at the first prediction last week. This is the second prediction in Matthew and in Mark and Luke. We see these predictions of his coming death. And we see that this is something that he told his disciples multiple times. It wasn't just one time, but multiple times. And this second one in Matthew and in Mark, we read that he told them three things that are going to happen. He said, the Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men. Then he says that they will kill him. And then after 3 days, he will rise. So he tells them three things that are going to happen. And Jesus is obviously very blunt and honest and open in saying, this is the direction that my life's heading. I'm going to be handed over, killed, but I will rise. The gospel writers also, they record the responses of the disciples, and it's hard because we kind of have heard this story so much, so we know that Jesus is going to go to the cross, but it's interesting to try to put ourselves in the shoes of the disciples and imagine what it would be like to be there and to be hearing Jesus say this when this is not on their radar at all. He said it once, but now he's saying it again. It would be so confusing to hear Jesus say that he's going to die and rise again. In Matthew, it says that the disciples were filled with grief. And in Mark, in chapter 9, it says that they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. It's kind of does not compute, and they're afraid and just sort of ignore and perhaps want to forget what Jesus has said. But it's interesting because, Jesus says, yes, he will die, but he says that he will rise again. But that doesn't seem to be a comfort to the disciples. They're just confused and just afraid, and it just doesn't make sense to them. Instead of just trusting him and taking him seriously, it seems like it's too fearful a thing to really consider. It's too scary a thing to ask more and talk more about, and perhaps they just wish that Jesus would stop saying this, or perhaps think that maybe he doesn't really mean this literally, maybe he's speaking cryptically. But whatever, it seems like their response is just to not want to accept the raw truth of what Jesus is saying. It's interesting to consider for ourselves, in what ways do we also not want to really seriously consider things that Jesus says to us? Perhaps because they're too difficult, or they're too confusing, or they make us afraid. Jesus says challenging things in the Gospels which are relevant to our lives still today, and perhaps there's some verses that we read but we just sort of quickly skip over them, and perhaps they even create in us a sense of grief and fear, and instead of engaging with that and asking God questions about that or going into deeper study with that, perhaps we just sort of hope that that's not relevant for us, or the things that Jesus says, like we talked about last week, even about taking up a cross, maybe they're not really serious. Perhaps there's even things that he says multiple times and has said to us multiple times, and we're just not willing to hear them because they don't fit our desires or our plans. But Jesus is honest. I love his honesty with the disciples, his honesty about what's going to happen to him. He's even honest about what will happen to them. And there's something really good just about that, about knowing the truth. Even when the truth is hard, it's still good to know the truth, but particularly when the truth is full of hope. Yes, he will die, but he will rise. Yes, he promises the disciples will suffer persecution themselves, but God will be with them, and there's hope and eternal life and their own resurrection to look forward to as well. So as we reflect leading into Easter, a couple of questions perhaps to consider today. Like the disciples, in what ways do I disregard things Jesus says because they're too difficult or too confusing, or because they make me afraid? what verses and sayings of Jesus do I quickly skip over instead of taking seriously? What promises about the future do I disregard or take lightly? And what would it look like to not only take what Jesus says about coming challenges seriously, but also take his promises about the future hope more seriously as well? Rise.